All right, we're on our very last chapter here, chapter 18. So in our last chapter for chapter 17, we kind of introduced the endocrine system and some of the organization and vocab terms related to the endocrine system. Now we're going to actually walk through all the different glands and most of the hormones that are relevant to us. Okay, so our endocrine system has a ton of functions. We saw in chapter 17 that our endocrine glands are spread out throughout the body and they have a huge effect on a ton of different things. So, metabolism, how hungry we are, how quickly we digest food, what happens with those nutrients after they're digested, tissue development, ion regulation, the list goes on and on. So you can see our endocrine system really affects all of our other body systems in some way or the other, and it even affects our own endocrine system. So you will see as we go through, especially the first couple of glands, certain hormones actually act on other parts of the endocrine system to help them work. All right, the first two are kind of the most important, partly because these are where some of our hormones that have a huge influence over other endocrine glands and body systems are contained. So the pituitary gland is sometimes referred to as the master gland because it has nine different hormones that work in a lot of different ways. And related to the pituitary, we have the hypothalamus. So our pituitary gland sits in the sella turcica of the sphenoid. That was one of your bone markings way back. And then we have the hypothalamus here. So we can see the pituitary from the underside of the brain once that sphenoid bone is removed. And just above it is the hypothalamus. The infundibulum is this stem that connects the hypothalamus to our pituitary gland. And so these kind of work as a team, and we'll talk about that relationship a little bit more as we get rolling. All right. So our pituitary gland is split into the anterior and posterior. The anterior pituitary actually makes and releases nine different hormones. It's referred to also as the adenohypophysis, partly because it is going to be influenced by the hypothalamus. The posterior pituitary, the neurohypophysis, is made of neural tissue, the neurohypophysis, and it's actually an extension of the hypothalamus. So this word adeno here means gland. That may be one way you can remember that the anterior pituitary both makes and releases its hormones. The posterior pituitary is really the storage center for the hormones made within the hypothalamus. And so the posterior pituitary only releases two hormones. It does not make any of its own. The hormones that are located in the posterior pituitary are made within the hypothalamus and are stored in the posterior pituitary. So our hypothalamus is really in charge of when our anterior pituitary secretes hormones or does not secrete hormones. And so we have this blood vessel system here, the hypophyseal portal system. Say that one three times fast. And so this is just the blood flow connection between the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary gland. And so remember, endocrine means that the hormones are going to travel within the bloodstream. So this is the way that the releasing and inhibiting hormones from the hypothalamus reach the anterior pituitary quickly. So they're still traveling through the bloodstream there. And so our hypothalamus is going to have releasing hormones that tell the anterior pituitary which hormone to release, and vice versa. There's also inhibiting hormones that are going to stop the release of hormones within the anterior pituitary. In terms of the posterior pituitary, these hormones are made by neurons within the hypothalamus. The posterior pituitary is really just our storage center. And so we have axons that actually run from the hypothalamus to the posterior pituitary. And so the action potentials are going to cause the release of hormones into the blood. So that's partly why we call it the neurohypophysis, because it's being stimulated by the neurons. The adenohypophysis, the anterior pituitary, is being stimulated or inhibited by actual hormones from the hypothalamus. The only two hormones that are in the posterior part of the pituitary gland are antidiuretic hormone, or ADH, and oxytocin. And so you'll see for a lot of our hormones, we tend to abbreviate them. So you kind of want to keep track of what our abbreviations are as we go through this as well. So the first one, ADH, is also known as vasopressin. And so this is, again, going to be released when stimulated by that hypothalamo-hypophyseal tract, the action potentials coming from the hypothalamus to the posterior pituitary. And a diuretic medication gets rid of water. So anti-diuretic hormone is going to tell our body to retain water. And so there's really two reasons why we would release anti-diuretic hormone. One of them is an increase in blood osmolarity. And the way you can think about that is more concentrated, thicker blood, because that means that we're becoming dehydrated and we need more water in the system. This is also going to be released related to low blood pressure or loss of blood volume. Blood pressure is controlled by multiple mechanisms, but one of the big influencers on this is blood volume. So if our blood volume is going low, our blood pressure is going to go lower with it. So one way we can increase that blood pressure is to retain more water, and that's going to increase our blood volume. Pain or stress also trigger antidiuretic hormone. So that's another one to remember. That's a little less intuitive. And in the grand scheme, we're going to retain more water and also decrease our urine output, because if we are getting rid of water through the urine, then we are losing water. So we're going to kind of slow down that loss of water. Vasoconstriction is also another result of this, because this is a way we can increase not necessarily the blood volume, that's more from the water part of things, but if we make our vessels smaller, that means pressure is going to go up. One thing I guess I should mention is diabetes insipidus, or DI. So that's not type 1 or type 2. That is another category of diabetes, and that's related to lack of ADH. So people with diabetes insipidus don't produce or release enough ADH, meaning that they're getting rid of too much water. So these are people that are thirsty all the time, and they produce a lot of urine because they don't have that hormone telling their body to retain enough water. Oxytocin is the other one that comes from the hypothalamus and is stored in the pituitary, or the posterior pituitary. We saw this as our only example of a positive feedback loop. And so this is released again in response to those action potentials. Childbirth is the big example of this. And so during childbirth, as the cervix and uterine muscles stretch, it causes oxytocin to release. That increases contractions of the uterus, which means more of a stretch, which means more release, which means stronger contraction. And you see that kind of snowballs until the birth process is complete. It's also released by suckling on the breast, because you'll see another one of our hormones, prolactin, is responsible for what I always say, promoting lactation. And so that is going to cause milk production, but milk production doesn't do us any good unless that milk is going to be released or ejected by the breast. So oxytocin is the important hormone in milk ejection, or what's sometimes called the milk letdown reflex. And so that's occurring in the mammary glands of the breasts. Oxytocin, besides these couple of conditions and functions, is also released in relation to relationships, is really the best way to put it. So oxytocin is really important for binding, or bonding, I should say. And so that's another area where we will see oxytocin release. It's one of the reasons why they encourage skin-on-skin contact between parents and baby early on. So the anterior pituitary hormones have many tropic hormones. And so tropic hormone means that it's going to actually cause the secretion of another hormone in a different gland. So That's partly why we named the pituitary the master gland, because it's kind of giving instructions or controlling the release of hormones in many of our other glands. So we're going to go through all of these, but here are all the different hormones that come from the anterior pituitary. Some of these are less important to us, so we'll leave them off of our list in terms of the ones we're going to go into a little more in depth. All right, growth hormone is also known as somatotropin. Um, it does exactly what it says. It contributes or encourages growth of pretty much all of our body's tissues. And if you remember, we said that our hormones only act on tissues with a specific receptor for that hormone known as a target tissue. And so GHRH is growth hormone releasing hormone. GHIH is growth hormone inhibiting hormone. And so that comes from the hypothalamus. It either promotes or inhibits growth hormone release. And you'll see that pattern with a lot of the anterior pituitary hormones. So some reasons that we release hormone is stress, if we don't have enough fatty acids available within the blood, as well as glucose levels. And so if we are kind of under stress, if we don't have enough energy, we're going to increase that growth hormone uh, releasing hormone. And so we're going to add growth hormone to the system. It breaks down adipose tissue in a process known as lipolysis. And it's also going to decrease our glucose uptake. We're going to make sure there's still glucose available in the bloodstream. Indirectly, this is going to result in the synthesis and secretion of insulin-like growth factors or IGFs within the liver. And really, the end result is that we're promoting the growth of body tissues. Growth hormone is typically released as a bolus at night. And so this is one of the reasons why, especially for kids, we recommend having a kind of static or consistent bedtime because our system is going to release growth hormone in response to that, and that's really why we recover somewhat during sleep. Prolactin promotes lactation. So we have prolactin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus or prolactin inhibiting hormone. This is going to cause milk production within the mammary gland. It's also helped with that job by estrogens and progesterone and some of the other things we find, especially within the female system. But prolactin promotes lactation. That's how I always remember that one. Thyroid stimulating hormone can also be called thyrotropin. So remember, our tropic hormones cause the release of a hormone in another gland. So this is another one that's a little straightforward. Thyroid stimulating hormone stimulates the thyroid. Again, we have the releasing hormone coming from the hypothalamus. And so this is going to result in the secretion and storage of T3 and T4 within the thyroid gland. And if you remember from lab, this is going to be specifically from the follicular cells of the thyroid gland. And both of those hormones largely contribute to the regulation of our metabolism. ACTH is adrenocorticotropic hormone, so it kind of tells you where it's acting. So it's going to influence the adrenal cortex. So it's a tropic hormone. We know there's going to be another domino in that pathway. A big kind of trigger for the release of this and the release of the corticotropic releasing hormone in the hypothalamus is stress, because we'll see one of our hormones affected by this is cortisol that is released in the adrenal cortex. This other category here is also related to that corticotropic releasing hormone. We have melanocyte stimulating hormone, produces melanin or increases the production of melanin. We have endorphins that are produced during stress and exercise, and this is kind of our natural analgesic. So analgesic is a fancy way of saying a pain protector, pain limiter. Lipotropins are going to cause adipose cells to break down fat. So that would be that lipolysis that we saw earlier. LH and FSH are found in both the male and female system, and they help regulate the production of our gametes, our sperm, and our oocytes. And so they are released in response to gonadotropin releasing hormone. So that's GnRH that you see down there. They work a little differently in the male and female system. So they both regulate gamete production. In males, they're going to regulate testosterone and sperm development. And in females, they're going to regulate estrogen and progesterone levels. LH is associated with ovulation. FSH is associated with the actual maturation of the oocyte within the follicle. All right, next one is the thyroid gland. So we saw thyroid stimulating hormone from the anterior pituitary, which stimulates the release of T3, T4. The other part is calcitonin that comes from the parafollicular cells of the thyroid. And so I always remember calcitonin tones down blood calcium. So it is part of the negative feedback loop that helps control our blood calcium levels. And so it tones down the calcium. If blood calcium levels get too high, we're going to release calcitonin to bring that back down. And the other half of that system comes from, sorry, the parathyroid gland. So parathyroid gland is going to be secreted when blood calcium is low. So just keep that in the back of your heads for now. And so T3 and T4 are made in the follicular cells of the thyroid. They're very, very similar. So iodine is part of the process in or kind of makeup of T3 and T4, but for the most part, they act in the same way. So remember, we call this intersection the follicle. And so the colloid is the liquid center of the follicle, and that's what actually contains the iodine, which is partly why it stains that color. So again, you want to kind of keep track of why would we release this? You see, stress is a trigger for a lot of our different hormones. Obviously, if we have low T3 and T4 levels, we want to bring that up. If we're cold, then we're going to bring that up. So that cold body T just means cold body temperature. So increasing our metabolism, adding more T3 and T4 is going to help us bring that temperature up. And then pregnancy is also going to cause some release of T3 and T4. So remember, this is kind of one that has multiple dominoes in the pathway. So we'll have thyroid releasing hormone from the hypothalamus, thyroid stimulating hormone from the anterior pituitary, and then actually T3 and T4 within the thyroid gland. And so this is a negative feedback system, meaning that T3 and T4 are going to or the presence of T3 and T4 having a high enough level is going to inhibit that thyroid releasing hormone from being released by the hypothalamus, which in turn is going to limit how much TSH is being released from the anterior pituitary. So the big thing with T3 and T4 is metabolism. So with people that have hyperthyroidism, they have a really high metabolic rate. For hypothyroidism, they have a low metabolic rate. And so in a sense, our basal metabolic rate, what we're using at rest, is going to determine how much glucose and fat we are breaking down and utilizing for ATP production. It's also going to stimulate protein production because proteins are pretty much needed for every function of the body. We said it increases body temperature, and because it's related to metabolic rate and the uptake of glucose and fat in our energy systems, it's going to have a big role in regulating growth and kind of maturation of our different organ systems. So super important. Calcitonin was the kind of outlier, not related to metabolism. So T3 and T4 came from the follicular cells. Calcitonin comes from the parafollicular cells. And so calcitonin tones down blood calcium. So if blood calcium is high, it is going to tell the bones to slow down their breakdown. So it inhibits osteoclasts. It's going to tell the osteocytes to suck up some of that calcium and lay some bone down. And we're also going to get rid of more calcium in the kidneys if we have too much in the blood. The parathyroid gland is an easy one to remember because it's only got one hormone and it's parathyroid hormone. So it's got one job. It's going to secrete parathyroid hormone if blood calcium gets too low. And so it does this in a couple different ways, kind of the opposite of calcitonin. It's going to increase bone resorption by the osteoclasts. So remember, clasts crush. So we're going to break down some of that calcium phosphate, making up the hard structure of our bones. We're going to increase rather than decrease the calcium reabsorption by the kidneys. And we're also going to promote calcitriol formation. So that's the active form of vitamin D, and that's partly what helps with this aspect. And it's going to cause us to keep some more of that calcium or absorb more calcium in the digestive system as well. All right, the adrenal glands you see appearing here as those yellow or orangish kind of highlighted things on top of the kidneys. So we call them the suprarenal glands because the renal system is our kidney system. And so they sit right on top of each kidney. They're kind of triangular shaped. And so we can break that into two different regions. We have the adrenal medulla, and then we have the adrenal cortex, and we can kind of subdivide that cortex into three different zones that have three different categories of hormones. All right, so this blue arrow here is pointing to our renal medulla. Think M for medulla, M for middle, and that contains epinephrine and norepinephrine. So epinephrine and norepinephrine both come from the medulla. When we go out to the cortex, we have a few different layers here. So going from superficial to deep, outside to in, we have the mineral corticoids from the zona glomerulosa. And so that's aldosterone is the primary one we'll talk about there. We have the zona fasciculata that releases the glucocorticoids. Cortisol is our stress hormone we'll talk about. It also has corticosterone. And then closest to the medulla, the zona reticularis has our adrenal androgens. So that's DHEA and testosterone. And we'll talk about that a bit more. Aldosterone is one of our major blood pressure regulation systems. And so this again is secreted if we have a low blood pressure. And the end result, this is one that goes through a lot of different pathways, but we're going to reabsorb sodium within the kidneys. And so that is going to increase our blood sodium levels. Sodium follows water, or sorry, vice versa. Water follows sodium. So when we retain more sodium, we retain more water. And just like we saw with ADH, more water retention equals higher blood volume, higher blood pressure. Cortisol is our stress hormone. So intermittent stress on the body is not a bad thing. It's actually a good thing. But prolonged high levels of cortisol can be a problem because one negative of cortisol is that it kind of depresses or suppresses our immune system. So we release cortisol in response to stress as well as low blood glucose, and that's going to result in cortisol releasing hormone to be released by the hypothalamus. Our anterior pituitary then reaches adrenocorticotropic hormone, and that tells the cortex to release cortisol. Again, a negative feedback loop here. So the increased cortisol levels then tell the hypothalamus to stop releasing that CRH, which results in we stop releasing ACTH and no more cortisol. So cortisol actually inhibits glucose use and it stimulates the formation of glucose from amino acids and lipids. So we're going to use proteins and fats to make more glucose. It's an anti-inflammatory. So this is one of the big things. Cortisone injections are steroid injections that help reduce inflammation. But like I said, it's going to depress the immune system. So we don't necessarily want high levels of cortisol for long periods of time. DHEA is a pretty weak androgen, and it's actually converted to testosterone once it gets out to our peripheral tissues. This is going to stimulate pubic and axillary hair growth, especially in males. And it's also what is a big drive or driver of the sexual drive in females. And this becomes even more important in terms of how much of a role it plays after menopause, so after the menstrual cycle ceases in females. NE stands for norepinephrine, E stands for epinephrine. So all those that we just went over were from the different layers of the adrenal cortex. Norepinephrine and epinephrine come from the medulla. So those are the only two from the medulla. And so again, stress, exercise or higher level physical activity, low blood glucose are going to result in the hypothalamus increasing its sympathetic nervous system stimulation. So remember, sympathetic was fight or flight. So that is what's going to cause the release of norepinephrine, epinephrine, which is also known as adrenaline. And so our sympathetic preganglionic neurons release acetylcholine, and that is what actually results in the release of epinephrine and norepinephrine. It's kind of getting our body jacked up, ready for physical activity. That's why they say adrenaline's flowing. This is what they're talking about. And so this goes through that pathway a little bit. So our different triggers here are going to result in the hypothalamus telling our sympathetic preganglionic neurons to increase their action potentials. And so that's going to end up going all the way to the adrenal medulla. And then once we have that epinephrine, norepinephrine being released, they're kind of the same thing, just different target tissues. And they're going to have all these different effects. And in the grand scheme, all these effects are helping to increase the supply of nutrients and energy to our muscles, as well as maintain oxygen and glucose supply to the brain. Because we can't just give it all to the muscles. We got to keep the main computer running. Okay, remember the pancreas is a mixed gland, meaning it has endocrine and exocrine functions, and it's actually got more exocrine cells than endocrine cells. So this bottom ticket here is our acinar cells, the exocrine portion of the pancreas, and it's creating digestive enzymes that are going to be contributed to the duodenum, the first section of our small intestine. The pancreatic isolates are scattered among the acinar cells. They're kind of the outliers, and that's the endocrine part of our system. So those contain our alpha cells and beta cells. Glucagon is going to be released when we have low blood glucose. It's going to happen when we have exercise or when we are exercising because we need more glucose available. And it also is released when we eat a lot of protein meals because carbs can be used for quick energy or quickly broken down to glucose. It's relatively efficient for the body to break fats into glucose. We don't like to spare proteins and make those into glucose because we need proteins for a lot of other things. Insulin's the opposite. It goes with our beta cells, and it's released when we have a higher blood glucose, and it's also released when we have increased parasympathetic stimulations. Remember, rest and digest. So we're going to release insulin because that's our time to digest and suck up that energy that we just got from our food. We use less of this, obviously, if our blood glucose is low because we need glucagon. We also just kind of the opposites. If sympathetic stimulation is going, you don't want to be worrying about digesting or utilizing that food. So that is going to decrease insulin. So the end result of glucagon is raising our blood glucose levels. And so it's doing that by breaking down glycogen into glucose. And a big area that we store glycogen is in the liver. We also store a lot of glycogen in our muscles, and we can use or kind of trigger the use of other nutrients like our fats and proteins if we're in a really bad spot to be converted by the liver into glucose. And eventually we're going to add that glucose into the blood. So it's released in response to low blood levels, but the end result is that it's going to raise our blood glucose levels. Insulin into the cells. So it lowers blood glucose by telling our body cells to uptake that glucose. This is also going to result in glucose being turned into glycogen for storage if we have excess glucose. And this is going to usually slow down that conversion of other nutrients into glucose because we're trying to get rid of the glucose we already have. And so here's just another way to look at this feedback loop of insulin and glucagon, if that helps you see it another way. Okay, the pineal gland and thymus. The thymus is related to our immune system primarily, promotes thymosin and thymopoietin, which promotes the maturation of our immune system's T cells. So this is part of the adaptive immune system. Our T cells are a type of lymphocyte. And so when we're first building up our immune system, building our army, the thymus is really active. And so it makes sense that it's going to be more active in childhood. Once we have our immune system established, it kind of slowly decreases in size throughout the lifespan. Remember, all blood cells start their production in the bone marrow. So the T cells actually begin in the bone marrow and then they travel to the thymus to mature before they're ready to be part of our immune system. The pineal gland is what secretes melatonin in the brain, and its big job is to regulate our circadian rhythm, the biological clock. It's going to be released in response to darker environments. It's one of the reasons why you don't want to be hanging out on your phone or watching TV right before you want to go to sleep. So you want those blackout curtains, the eye mask, whatever is going to help secrete more melatonin. And then getting to the end here, we talked about LH and FSH that come from the anterior pituitary that influence the reproductive system in different ways, whether it's male or female. In the male system, the gonad is the testes, which is going to be our primary sex hormone producer. That's testosterone. So, sperm development and the development of secondary sex characteristics, which are kind of all the things you think about when you think about changes that happen with puberty. From the ovaries, we're going to release estrogen and progesterone. So the ovaries are the gonad of the female system. Oocyte is another name for egg cell, and so that's going to promote the development. Again, the secondary sex characteristics. The menstrual cycle itself is governed by the changes in levels in the cycle of hormones that happens within the female system. And progesterone, especially, is going to maintain a higher level to ensure that pregnancy is maintained, or when implantation or a woman becomes pregnant, it's going to sustain some of these hormone levels so that the uterus can support and nourish the embryo and fetus. All right, I know that was a lot. The main thing that I want you guys to focus on for this chapter is obviously know which hormones go with which glands, keep track of which hormones may cause the stimulation of other glands or other hormones, those tropic hormones, and just obviously the effect of the hormone itself. So I know those are a lot, but you're on your last chapter, so keep pushing and congratulations, and thank you for your hard work this entire semester.